Well, hello. My guest this afternoon is Canon Lynda Barley, who's been at the Cathedral since December 2011, I think, as Canon Pastor, and has had several diocesan roles in the meantime. She's currently parish priest and also rural dean as well for her sins, and only spends 2 and a bit days at the Cathedral. But I'm sure that's one of those instances where 2 halves make more than a whole, at least 3 and 3 3/4, I would say. Prior to coming here, Lynda headed up the statistics department division at Church House, and she's a trained mathematician and statistician and does some open university teaching in that light as well. I think that's right, isn't it, Lynda?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, welcome to this first of a series of interviews, and it's good to see you here. You're just about to retire from us, and so we thought it'd be a good thing to have you have a conversation with you as this change of direction occurs.
Yeah, thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
Lovely. And could you tell us first of all a bit about your background and what led you to Cornwall and to Truro Cathedral in particular?
Well, we were living in the southwest. We are Southwest family, and we were living in the southwest. But I got courted when I hadn't been ordained very long to actually work in London in church research. And I became head of the research and statistics department and brought together empirical evidence-based research with church work. And it was sort of pioneering stuff, as it were. But I've always wanted to bring it together with my ministry. And in going up to London to take on the role, my ministry took a bit of a back foot. And so I always wanted to come back to the southwest and actually go back to bringing my ministry much more to the fore, but hopefully bringing it to connect with the church research that I've been doing and, put it into practice, basically. And that's been good, and that's what's happened.
Mm-hmm. And living and working in Cornwall over the last 8 years, what do you think has been the most distinctive thing about that? What's really engaged you in terms of ministry, but also perhaps using some of your professional background as well?
I think what's really challenged me is that you have to in ministry of any sort, any reaching out to people, you have to listen to the people. And I always knew as a researcher that actually you had to do a lot of listening in all sorts of ways and bring qualitative reflection to all the statistics so that you knew what they meant and you knew what people meant by them. But I've learned that really at first hand, because when you go below the surface, particularly in somewhere like the Duchy of Cornwall, actually you find that there's hidden treasures below the surface that you hadn't quite grasped when you looked at all the top line statistics. And it's been really enriching to bring what you might call local culture together with faith and religion and interpret one against the other. It's been great, and putting it into practice to actually journey with people in their journey of faith has been enriching for me too.
I suspect being a complete amateur when it comes to looking at statistics, behind each of the numbers there's a particular human story, isn't there?
Yeah, and sometimes it's not obvious. I mean, one of the examples that I actually learned early on when I came down to Cornwall was that you can walk up to somebody and say, do you go to church? And they can say yes, and they can mean a totally different thing to what you meant when you asked the question. Because those of us that are habitual Sunday attenders might well think, if you don't go on Sunday, you're not a churchgoer. But other people would say, that's fine. I go when I want to go. I go to feast days and holidays. I go at times that are meaningful to me, and therefore I'm a churchgoer. And if you put the regular in front of it and you ask somebody if they're a regular churchgoer, then it even gets more nuanced. So quite often the terminology that we in the church have just got lazy really and hidden behind, you find that there's a whole gamut of interpretations, and you need to understand those to actually unpack it all and realize that church quite rightly means different things to different people.
Yeah, I suspect that culture is everything. I mean, culture eats strategy for breakfast and all that. And what from some perspective might be an ordinary ordinarily termed question for another perspective means a completely different thing, as you just,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, yes. And who are we to judge? I think that's how I've learnt on the way too. We can be very judgmental in church life, and God is there for everybody and takes them on an equal level, and we need to do the same. Nobody is the harbour of all the truth. We all have to learn from each other, don't we? And we see God in each other too.
Very much, absolutely. And I suspect we live in an era now where the doom merchants are having their sixpenny worth, that church attendance is slipping away, that we're all becoming very elderly congregations. Is there anything from your research and your career in statistical analysis that leads you to challenge that in any way?
Oh, absolutely. I think the secularists who say that's, we become a secular country, have forgotten that actually we might not be a big C Christian country, but we are a small c Christian country, where so much of our culture comes from that background. And people and the way they're reacting in this pandemic, looking out for their neighbour, is a Christian just instinct in us that we just have in this country and in other parts of the world too, where we do just know that we're all equal. We don't try and promote one over the other. The NHS treats everybody as equal. It's instinctive. Our justice system is, innocent till proved guilty. We are quite strongly enculturated, as they say, in Christian things. And sociologists have been, sparring over this for decades now. But I think they realise that sometimes we've been counting the wrong things. And I always had a mantra that you only counted what you thought was important. And sometimes we haven't thought the right things are important enough to count. And the way people watch songs of praise or whatever, that's part of their Christianity.
Yes, and we often hear this, don't we, that to get the survey, the answer you want, you must ask the question to elicit the answer you want, and all that thing. I think
absolutely.
Many people are past masters at that.
Yeah, quite.
Turning, I think, to the cathedral, as you've served the cathedral so wonderfully well over these last eight and more years. What have you gained from your time at the cathedral, would you say, Lynda?
I've gained far more than I've given. I've gained a wonderful spiritual base and support, which has enabled me to wrestle with some of the doubts and debates in my own life. It's given me a rootedness, which travelling up and down to London I certainly didn't have. And getting to know a community of faith and reaching out from it has been hugely enriching. I've had two little parishes alongside, and therefore I've had what you might call the small is beautiful, and I've also had the larger scale, for congregational experiences, which have been very uplifting too. I've had formal worship and I've had informal worship. The range, the menu of practice that I've been able to enjoy has been lovely. So I've gained so much, and my husband's been alongside me, and that's been good, because in London I was very much on my own. So actually to be more together has been lovely for the family too.
I know, and in thanking you as we do, we thank Chris as equally, because he's been a wonderful partner and a support for you in all sorts of ways. So we thank Chris very much indeed, and pity he can't be here with us to give his thoughts as well.
Yes.
It's good to speak to you. When you talk about the different things you've been doing, how do you keep this balance going? I mean, job at the cathedral, job in the parish, rural dean. How do you find the time to manage all this?
I suppose one of the things I have found myself in, which has been a little bit disconcerting, is that I've been in reactive mode. Because there've been, quite a few demands, and so I've had to sort of prioritise those, and I've been in reactive mode. When I was working full-time in research, I was much more in proactive mode, where I went out and sought things and explored, you know, areas of interest. But both are equally valid. I think you have to learn to balance them and make sure you get some time yourself, just take a step back. But there, the cathedral's been wonderful, because to sit through evensong and just have that warm spiritual bath come over you is just so totally empowering for going, you know, whatever's next on the agenda. So I've found it actually quite an inspiring balance to keep going, and I've enjoyed every bit of it, and the range. It's been lovely.
Excellent, thank you for that. And when you are able to take your foot off the pedal, what sort of things do you enjoy doing? Are you a binge watcher? Do you keep orchids? What is it that keeps the Barley household sane?
we are quite active. My daughter is a PE teacher, and that probably tells you quite a bit. When I first was thinking, what do I want to do in the world of work, I did start in the world of teaching, and I taught mathematics, but I taught PE alongside. And actually, you know, given half a chance, we're out on a tennis court or we're walking. Chris does a bit of sailing when he can. We're sort of active people. But that's not to say we don't enjoy sitting down with a good book and watching a bit of television, and doing, in this pandemic time, increasingly, like everybody else, the odd family quiz on Zoom.
Yes. Do you have specialist subjects when you do the quizzes at all, or do you revert to your statistical background and floor your opponents with all that analysis?
We are a family of scientists, so I guess yes. My father was a researcher, and I'm a researcher. My brothers are both in engineering and electronics and IT, and you know, so it goes on across our families. So there are specialist subjects.
What do you think the current situation might be telling us? That the lockdown, the fact that we can't physically get together at the moment and are doing lots of this online communication. Are there lessons that we can learn for the future? And perhaps what is it telling us about what God might be saying amidst all this?
Yeah, one of the things I was always regretting, really, when I was in the world of research full time, was that we were become a society where, you know, I mattered more than the wider perspective, the community life. One of the things I hope we've learned from this pandemic, or are learning from this pandemic, is actually that community life and the common good is a really important thing for each one of us. So for me as an individual to flourish, I actually need a community life. I need my neighbour. I need the common good to be much more prominent than it has been. There's a very well-known book in the world of sociology by Putman, an American writer, called Bowling Alone. And the sociologists used to say, you know, we've become a society, both that side of the Atlantic and this side, where the individual mattered far more, and individual rights had risen to the top and become prominent quite rightly, but had really, you know, taken over. And the common life, the community life, which a lot of the wartime generation, of course, knew really well, has been lost on the way. And I hope that this pandemic will perhaps draw our attention to that, and that we learn to actually pay more attention to, you know, to each other, and realise how enriching that is for each one of us.
And will the church have a part to play in this sort of reawakening of the idea of the community, would you say?
I think very much so, depending on, of course, how it plays out, how we end up meeting, whether it's virtually or physically. I think we know that we need each other. Part of the Christian faith is that we're called into the family of God, and the body of Christ, as you might call it too. And that, you know, that is dependent on each member, and each member is equal. And so we're a quite flat community of faith, and I think therefore the church can bring a lot to that. And it's got people, I remember doing some research into volunteers, and the church at the time, this is 10 years ago now, but the church had by far the biggest community of volunteers out working in society, in our country than any other organisation. The only one that came anywhere near it was the National Trust with their membership. And then, of course, I think that those listening will understand it's a totally different sort of membership. You pay your money and you don't have to turn up. You can just do what you like. Volunteering in the church is much more actually participation. And you don't need to pay your money, though it's lovely if you can, but you don't, it's a different dynamic. But we forget what a huge volunteer force we've actually got in the church, working out in our communities. And talking with Bishop Philip only yesterday, he's really encouraged the number of people that are approaching him because they know the church is in touch with local community groups and can find out who needs the help and who doesn't through the food banks and things like that.
And we don't always value that contribution, that vast contribution. And so I think highlighting that is a really, really worthwhile thing to do. Now, you're coming up to the dreaded R word, retirement. Have you got any thoughts and plans for the future once we can readjust back to what might be considered a more normal way of life? Have you got any thoughts and plans for the future, you and Chris?
Well, one of the things we have been wanting to do, which our youngsters did when they took their gap years, was we thought we might have a senior gap year. And we might go off in a camper van and just go and I had a friend who did it around Europe. And we thought, well, we could do that, but we could actually perhaps even go over to the other side of the Atlantic and do something over there and hire a camper van. But because at the moment, that's just a dream. But it is something we'd quite like to do, just be a bit footloose and fancy free and be able to follow the old brick road and go where we like. So to see the world a little bit would be quite good, because I think our youngsters these days have whetted our appetite and we feel we missed out a little bit.
Well, I'm sure you'll have a fantastic time doing that. Yes, your Jack Kerouac moment on the road.
Yeah.
Now, we have, as a sort of common feature for these little talks, we have asked people to think of a favourite poem or extract from a piece of literature or something. I was wondering if you'd got something for us in that vein, Lynda.
Well, I was thinking about this. One of my favourite poets is George Herbert, and many of our hymns, use his poetry. And I nearly thought I would share with you something from him. But then in these last days, I've come, particularly being, of course, in Cornwall with everybody, I've become to realise just how important Celtic spirituality is, and I really enjoy it. That's another thing actually that has enriched me since coming down to Cornwall. And I've come across the Irish Celtic poet John O'Donoghue, who was a priest, but then moved into being more of a full-time poet and philosopher. Died at a very young age of just 52 back in 2008. And he's written some poetry which, as I was pondering this pandemic, I've found really helpful. One of them was about patience and how we need the time to be slow. But another one, which I thought I'd share with you, is a blessing for the one who is exhausted. And as I've come to ponder it, I've pondered it on two levels, one on a personal level, but one also on a national level, when we're talking about how we milk the earth and how we may have exhausted it. So if it's all right with you, I'll read you this one.
That'd be wonderful, Lynda. Thank you.
Okay, it's called A Blessing for One Who Is Exhausted. When the rhythm of the heart becomes hectic, time takes on the strain until it breaks. Then all the unintended falls in on the mind like an endless increasing weight. The light in the mind becomes dim. Things you could take in your stride before now become laboursome events of will. Wearisome invades your spirit. Gravity begins falling inside you, dragging down every bone. The tide you never valued has gone out, and you are marooned on unsure ground. Something within you has closed down, and you cannot push yourself back to life. You have been forced to enter empty time. The desire that drove you has relinquished. There is nothing else to do now but rest and patiently learn to receive the self you have forsaken for the race of days. At first your thinking will darken and sadness take over like listless weather. The flow of unwept tears will frighten you. You have travelled too fast over false ground. Now your soul has come to take you back. Take refuge in your senses. Open up to all the small miracles you rushed through. Become inclined to watch the way of rain when it falls slow and free. Imitate the habit of twilight, taking time to open the well of colour that fostered the brightness of day. Draw alongside the silence of stone until its calmness can claim you. Be excessively gentle with yourself. Stay clear of those vexed in spirit. Learn to linger around someone of ease who feels they have all the time in the world. Gradually, you will return to yourself, having learned a new respect for your heart and the joy that dwells far within slow time.
Oh,
I found that quite thoughtful.
very beautiful. I think it's so appropriate for where we are at the moment as well. And I love that line, open up to the small miracles.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
often they contain everything, and we buy so quickly in our day-to-day routines, don't we?
Yeah. I like the different levels you can interpret it on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very rich, very rich. And so thank you for sharing that with us, Lynda. And thank you for your time. I think our time is up. And it's been a time to talk with you. I'm sure we could carry on for longer, but this goes with our heartfelt thanks and blessing for you and on Chris for all you've done for us. And we will keep in touch. You're always going to be a friend of the Cathedral and its community. And every blessing upon you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. God bless everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.